everyone, welcome to the Ancestry and Legacy Project. This is our new platform for addressing a number of issues related to ancestry and history. This is an inaugural program, so welcome. Hoping that you can get some really good information from the program. We're going to be looking at some issues that we can't look at on some other platforms adequately. And so we're going to be able to address issues related to ancestry, whether we're talking about American ancestry, European, African ancestry, it doesn't matter. We'll be able to tackle all of those issues right here. And we're going to start off today with an important topic. We're going to be looking at proving your lineage. And what we're going to do toward the end is we're going to look at what the federal government actually has historically looked at in terms of making claims related to ancestry. And so you're going to get to see an actual testimony. You're going to get to see parts of that testimony so that you can get a better idea of what it is that you might need to provide if you are yourself looking for restoration for yourself, or you're looking for restoration for your eventual descendants. And we're also going to address a thorny issue, and that thorny issue is the inseparable heritage and claims of those who are identifying as American descendants of slavery and those who are identifying as American Indian or Indigenous Americans. And as always, if you see this video on any other platform that is not the Ancestry and Legacy Project, either here or on Patreon, it is stolen and unauthorized. Let's get started. All right, so let's address this issue of the inseparable heritage, ancestry, history, and claims of American descendants of slavery and Indians. Now, to be clear, there needs to be a separation in terms of the claims of those who are in the Caribbean and those who are on the continent of America, so the mainland. Those claims are separate. Right now, CARICOM has claims going on, and those are very specific claims because those are actual entire country claims. And the ones for those in mainland America, I'm just going to say America, meaning United States of America, those claims are for discrete groups of people. And so it's not for the entire country. It's for those very discrete groups of people with a specific lineage. And one of the problems is when you try to mix all of those claims together, things get muddier than they already are. And so there needs to be an attempt made to clean up these claims and make them as specific as possible in terms of the claimants. And one thing to note is that while individuals in the Caribbean can make claims related to European governments, they can make claims related to American governments. They can also make claims to their own governments. And the same thing applies for those who are identifying as American Indian and those who are identifying as American descendants of slavery. Want to add something to that. Those claims from both groups, so you're talking about the Caribbean and mainland America, certain individuals with a particular lineage, meaning they were actually descended from African slaves, those individuals would also have a claim against certain African sovereigns. And so that's a very specific, discrete group, and they actually have multiple claims. And one of the things that happens, and it comes from this ridiculous dynamic known as blood quantum. And this was created by Europeans and pushed onto American Indians and those who are identifying themselves as Native Americans now. This was pushed onto them. This idea has really no legal basis. When you even look at European history, European law, it has no legal basis. When you are a descendant of your ancestors, no matter how far down the line you go. There's no such thing as being 1/4 of a descendant of an ancestor. You are 100% descendant of your ancestor. Even though that's not 100% of your genetics, you are still 100% the grandson or the granddaughter. You're not a portion of a grandson or a granddaughter. In other words, you don't stop being a Jones or a Smith simply because you are, 5 generations down the line. And this entire blood quantum dynamic and the entire one drop rule, all of that was a fallacious attempt to either oppress people or to preclude people from receiving what was rightfully theirs. And so that's a dynamic that people, pretty much have to get out of their heads. And so when you're talking about all of these different claims and some individuals having claims against African sovereigns, that is related specifically to them having that lineage. And all it takes, it doesn't matter, how many ancestors you had that were African or Indian or colored or European. Those were your ancestors. And so you always have the claims of your ancestors within you. And so to make it more clear, if you have European ancestors, African ancestors, Indian ancestors, those are all of your ancestors. And if all of those ancestors had diverse claims, you also conceivably can have diverse claims. So there's no need for people to be arguing about anyone being included or excluded. There is a place for every single person in terms of that ancestry and making claims related to ancestry, whether you're talking about slavery or you're talking about colonization. Now, I will add this because this might be part of the consternation related to CARICOM. A number of individuals from the Caribbean live in the United States or they live in Europe. Some live in Africa. And so CARICOM would be wise to make sure that they make accommodations for those particular individuals, which undoubtedly they will, but that needs to be made clear. Same thing for those who are identifying as American descendants of slavery. There need to be accommodations made for those who have decided to relocate to some other country. Now, given that it's very difficult to find ancestors for many people, there's really no point in talking about or trying to hash out, what should happen in terms of, Indians who were deported and taken to Africa. The likelihood that they still have an understanding of their heritage if they were enslaved in Africa is slim. The same thing goes for Indians who were taken to Europe or Africans who were taken to Europe. You can only focus on, pretty much one thing at a time in terms of these claims. And so the more people you try to include in claims, the muddier it gets and the more difficult it's going to be to achieve any goals related to, some of you are using the term redress, some of you are using the term restoration, reparations, whatever the re-term is, it becomes more difficult the more people that you include in those claims. But that being said, A.D.O.S. and American Indians, those who are from the uncivilized tribes, those claims are inseparable, and it is going to be impossible to go forward with claims for either of those groups if there is an attempt to exclude either of those groups. And so that needs to be clear. One of the reasons for this is that some individuals are saying, well, the Indians were not enslaved. The Indians were the first to be enslaved. Enslaved simply means you are working against your will. You do not want to do it. Your life has been commandeered. And whether you were colonized or straight enslaved, or there was some of that, the bastardy laws that they were using to enslave people, or someone was an indentured servant and then they were not released from that indentured servitude, all of that is slavery. Same thing with American descendants of slavery. You're talking about the institution of slavery. And so you're talking about the institution of slavery that included individuals who were identified as Indian or colored or mulatto or Black Dutch, Black Scottish, Black Irish. And so it included all of these, different groups of people. You can parse out who is appropriate for claims at another point in time, and I'm sure the government will help with that. But for now, those claims and those ancestry, those histories, they cannot be really separated. And those of you who are identifying as Indian, when you look on your birth certificate, 9 times out of 10, it does not say Indian. It says either Negro or Black or colored or African American. And so at one point in time, your ancestors were experiencing the vestiges of slavery, even if they were not enslaved, meaning they experienced Jim Crow. They experienced deprivation of rights. They experienced not receiving equal protection. And so some of you who are identifying as A.D.O.S. and some of you who are identifying as Indians, having fights about who's entitled to what and who's right and who's wrong, it's not going to serve you well. Those claims and those identities are inseparable. And one of the things that we're going to address is the issue of ancestry and phenotype. It is often said by many people in America, in the Americas, that they know for sure that they have no African ancestry because the African phenotype is not their phenotype. Well, it depends on where you're looking in Africa. And sometimes people will say they know that the people who identify as Black or Negro or colored, that they are not American Indian because they do not have the phenotype of the standard Native American person who is seen in, in the media. And so you have on the screen individuals who are from diverse backgrounds, and you can see in their phenotype that many people in the Americas, in America, share these phenotypes. You have one individual who is Fulani, who is up at the top left-hand side, and then you have Indigenous Americans, and then you have individuals down at the bottom who are Indigenous American, American Indian, and then you also have some individuals with Haitian background. And so you can see that even with this diversity, you can see the similarities running through these phenotypes. And you also have to remember, for those of you who are identifying as Indian, part of that narrative is that many people were deported from America and they were taken to Africa, not just Liberia and Sierra Leone, they were taken to Africa. And so when you see different people in Africa, you might pick up on some of those phenotypes. The people didn't just disappear. Also, people will say that there were very few Africans who were actually brought over in the transatlantic slave trade. And some people will admit or own that there were approximately 300,000. Well, the 300,000 didn't disappear. And so that means that they still exist and that they are still here and that they are among you. They are a part of your families. And while some people may be uncomfortable with accepting different parts of their heritage, it is your heritage. It is your reality. It's your truth. It's your bloodline. It's your DNA. And here you can see more Indigenous American people, and you can notice the phenotype looks very, very familiar. Sometimes the faces are very round, very soft looking faces, and you can see these faces in many people right now. And we have some more depictions here of quote unquote Black Indians, brown Indians, dark Indians, and also again the Fulani. And while many people, again, will say that they have no African ancestry, the fact of the matter is that the people who were enslaved generally did not have names in the slave census. And so it's almost impossible to know if those people didn't have names, the extent to which they may have actually been your ancestors. And so again, when you look at the faces of certain groups in certain regions in Africa, you will see the faces of those who are understood as African American, Black American, Indian in the United States. You will have a number of individuals claiming that indigenous people historically did not look like what you would identify as an African American today, a Black American, but indeed they did. And you can see from the profile, you can see that phenotype. You can also see a similar phenotype again in the two females with African ancestry. And so again, making those blanket statements suggesting that people have no Indian ancestry or they have no African ancestry, it is perhaps erroneous in terms of understanding the totality of the histories of the people who are in America right now, and even the people who are in Africa right now. You know, while they're doing all this DNA testing, it would be interesting for them to test the DNA of those in Africa and see how much of that actually traces back to the Americas. And then you have another camp, usually the Pan-African and the Pan-Indian camps. They will insist that they have no European heritage. The fact of the matter is that Europeans, just like Americans, just like Africans, just like Caribbeans, they came in a variety of complexions and phenotypes. And so to make those blanket assertions that you have no European history is, again, erroneous. You can look at these pictures, you can look at these depictions and clearly see that they resemble the phenotypes of those in the Americas. Many people, again, will insist that they have no ancestry from Europe, and that is a misunderstanding. There were many individuals deported, as we've talked about on some other videos, out of Europe for high treason. Those primarily who supported the Stuart clan, the Stuart family, they were deported. And those who were backing Cromwell, many of them came also. And so it's not possible to actually say in terms of blanket terms that no one in America who identifies as African American or Black American, that none of them had any European ancestry simply because their skin color is dark. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they did have European ancestry simply because their skin color is light. People come in all shapes and sizes, and people who ended up in the Americas came from all over the world. The most important thing, though, is not about skin color or phenotype. It's about that lineage, because you can have two people from two different lineages look similar. You can have two people from the same lineage look very different. Okay, let's quickly address this issue as we go forward. We're going to be now addressing the issue of what does the federal government look for in terms of ancestry and in terms of clarifying ancestry. A number of people are doing research right now on their ancestry, and those who are identifying as A.D.O.S, they are definitely going to need to do their ancestry research. Same thing with those who are identifying as American Indian. You're going to have to do that research, and you're going to have to find at least one ancestor who fits that criteria. Undoubtedly, that is the case. And there are many ways for your ancestors to be identified as whatever it is you are attempting to identify them as, whether you're talking about them being enslaved, or whether you're talking about them being Indians, or whether you're talking about them being Africans who were enslaved, or Indians who were enslaved. If they were Indians who became a part of the civilized tribes, or they remained as the uncivilized tribes. Now, what this is a dialogue between a couple of YouTubers. They were questioning my ancestry, and so there was a lot of discussion going on, and this sprung from an individual or a group of individuals. It's hard to know exactly. They created a website that was supposed to be an official registry of individuals. Now, of course, because I know how the official registries come about, I immediately knew that this website was fake, meaning that this was not going to create an actual official registry. And we're going to look at some testimony so you can see how the federal government creates these quote-unquote registries. And so the individual had me on their website, and they were asked to remove me from the website and did not do so in an expedient manner. And so there was a video made responding to this, indicating that this was not a legitimate website in terms of what it was saying that it was going to do. And in response to that, the individual or group or whatever they are decided to go on a cyber stalking and doxing campaign in relation to me. So this is a part of their cyber stalking dynamic. And so what they were saying is that they did not believe that I was one of us, whatever one of us means, because again, you don't know the identities of these people on the internet. People who are claiming to be Indian, claiming to be A.D.O.S, you don't know that, and so they could be anyone. However, there is this conversation that's going on, and then the indication that they were watching lots of the videos and trying to discern from the videos my ancestral heritage. So I'm not sure how they thought they were going to do that, but at any rate, and so there was a belief from the individual who was responding that they believed that I identified as an Aboriginal American, and then linked me to Dane Calloway's belief that they believed that the ancestors of those identifying as African American, Indigenous, Black American, that they were not slaves, but rather indentured servants. And so I'm going to say this, if you see anyone online creating ancestral roles or anything like that, be leery of that. You don't know these people. There's no reason why anyone would be online creating roles of people for any legitimate purpose. And the fact that the person engaged in cyber stalking me in response to addressing this lets you know what it is that they were likely going to do with information from other people. So they started cyber stalking and doxing and things like that. And so undoubtedly, if this is what they were doing in response to being called on this behavior, they would undoubtedly engage in perhaps even worse behavior for those who would give them their information online through this particular website. And if you want to create roles, you can create roles, preliminary roles if you are A.D.O.S, with your family, with your church groups, legitimate groups that actually know who you are, where they would just be simply creating a list of people who are identifying in terms of that ancestry. They don't need to have all of your information. And when you see this testimony, you'll see why it's not necessary for anyone else other than the government to have this information. And unless, of course, you actually belong to a tribe. For instance, Chief Warhorse keeps all of the information that's necessary for her tribal members in Louisiana. So again, if you are not familiar with the person, there's really no reason why you should be putting your ancestral information online for some random website or some random person that you do not know. And another thing to note, there's a notation about me not using us and instead saying you all or things like that. My job is not to identify. My job is to educate. And so I might be educating on a number of issues related to a number of groups of people. And so that might be why you might hear something other than us. My focus is not on us. My focus is on educating, regardless of what your ancestral heritage may or may not be. Okay, so for many people, the question is, are they descendants of American slavery? And that's a different question than are they descendants of American slaves? Finding an actual ancestor who was enslaved and who was an African who was enslaved is going to be very difficult for many people. The reason for this is when you look at the census 1860 going back, you'll notice that on the slave schedules you may have information about the race of the person enslaved and the sex and age of the people enslaved, but there usually are not any names. And sometimes even Indians were excluded from the slave schedules. Now, one of the things that might give an indication that your ancestor was enslaved is the 1870 census. And so if you did not see your ancestor's name on the 1860 census, but you suddenly see your ancestor's name on the 1870 census and your ancestor is an adult at that time, that may be an indication that that person was previously enslaved, and so therefore the specificity would not have been there for the 1860 census. And so that might give you some direction to go in terms of your research, but of course that's not proof positive that your ancestor was indeed African and that your ancestor was indeed enslaved. Again, people could have been enslaved for a variety of reasons and not always a part of the transatlantic slave trade from Africa. Many people were enslaved from Europe, and many people were brought up from the Caribbean, and there was a lot of exchanging going on in that situation. And you'll notice if you look at the slave schedules from the 1800s, you won't see the names, but you will see individuals who were free black people or free persons of color. But again, all you need to find is one enslaved ancestor if you are looking specifically for a person in your lineage who was African and enslaved. And so it's going to be a challenge, but you may find that individual. Now, again, we have the depictions of the people out on the road in the boot heel during the Depression era. And these were the sharecroppers who were basically cheated out of the revenue that they were supposed to receive from the farmers that came from the federal government. And as you can see, more depictions of individuals who were out on the road in the boot heel. And let me clarify for you, these individuals were living literally out on the road, and this was a part of a demonstration. Since the farmers were not paying them, they moved out on the road as a demonstration, and they were literally living out on the road. And so when you're talking about A.D.O.S. and redressing or addressing the vestiges of slavery, these are the vestiges of slavery. Jim Crow is a vestige of slavery. And it doesn't matter whether you were identifying as Indian or your family members were identifying as Indian. There was no way to really escape this dynamic that was going on, because it was really skin color based, it was really phenotype based, and no one was going to stop and ask whether the person was identifying as Indian or they were identifying as Negro or colored. And now we have more depictions of people out on the road in the boot heel, and we have Little Hayfan, and we have James Scott. And some of your ancestors may have been enslaved and deported in relation to Hayfan, and some of your ancestors may have been enslaved and deported in relation to James Scott. And James Scott, again, is another Stuart. And you can note that the name Hayfan, Hofan, and other variations are found in Louisiana and some other discrete places in the United States. And also, presumably, those family members should be located in Barbados. And some people are under the mistaken belief that you can gauge whether someone was enslaved based upon their skin color, whether they were melanated or not. And that is inaccurate. And as you can see in New Orleans, children were enslaved irrespective of skin color. And so the one-drop rule was really, really important. If someone had Indian blood in them, they were subject to perhaps being enslaved, people who were considered mulatto. And as you can see, the people out on the road in the boot heel had a variety of skin tones and phenotypes. And this comes back to that dynamic of people trying to create alliances with people who are not necessarily in their lineage, and then distancing themselves from people who were perhaps actually in their lineage. They are actual cousins. As a matter of fact, this quick story about what happens in Louisiana in particular often is you'll have families that are darker and lighter from the same ancestors, and they will have the same last name, the same surname, but it will be pronounced differently. And so you can use the cousins and the cousins for example. And so you have the ones that are lighter, who might be even passing for white or might be identified as white. They might be referred to as the cousins. The ones who are dark or who might be identifying as black or Creole, they would be identified as the cousins. The fact is, these are the same people. And so you need to be cautious about that when you're doing your ancestry research, because you may find family members all over the place with all sorts of identifiers. You'll find Indians who are identified as mulatto. You'll have the women in the family identified as mulatto, and then the men in the family identified as black. And so you'll find all sorts of interesting things when you start to do your actual ancestry research, and you have to keep your mind open in terms of what you might find. And so if you close your mind, you're going to close off all sorts of opportunities to find out who you really are. Okay, now we have gotten to the testimony part. And so this is a sample of testimony for Indian benefits. And this testimony is given to, or was given to, the Department of the Interior. So this isn't given to someone online. This information is done under oath. And there are very specific questions that are involved in the examination. And so if you are searching for your ancestors, one of the things that you might want to do, in addition to just identifying them, is if they were Indian, you should be able to also find some of their applications for benefits. And this is a grandparent's application by examination. And so you can quickly see some of the questions that are asked. So it's not as simple as, people might believe it will be, basically identifying as African American or Negro for the last however many years. They really want to know quite a bit of information, and then they want data, they want evidence that goes along with the testimony. And so they ask, specific questions like the person's name. And this was for an individual who did not relocate to Indian country, which would have been out west. And so this is for individuals remaining in the Indian Territory in the South. And so some of the questions are, what is the person's name, age, what county. They want to know where they lived and how long they lived in a particular place. And part of this is done in order to get an idea of what tribe or what nation they should be applying for. And you can see that the questions go on and on about where did the person live, where were they born. There are all sorts of questions about, parentage, who was the mother, who was the father, through which parents did the person derive their Choctaw blood. And so there are very, very specific questions, and they actually were asking about blood quantum. And so they were asking for my grandparent to give the blood quantum for each of the parents. Okay, and so you can also see where there is a question about how much Choctaw blood is being claimed by my grandparent. And one of the things that they were doing, which is erroneous in terms of actual lineage, is trying to place people with one tribe or another, and often ignoring the fact that people might be from different lineages. You know how you have your mother's lineage and your father's lineage. Those are not necessarily the same quote-unquote tribes. But there was this move to make people sort of denounce or disinherit from one tribal nation to the other. And so one of the other things that they do in this process is they try to identify all of the people in the lineage who might be claim holders. And so they try to find out if the person is married, is the spouse also a claim holder? If there were children, are the children claim holders? Because when it came to giving out land, not only was land given out to the adults, but land was also provided for the children. And so one of the things that some of you might notice, if you look in your family's history and your family has land, particularly in the South, that's usually where this occurred, and you find out that your family received land, or there was some sort of land grant, or they acquired some land around about the the early 1800s, one thing to look out for is whether this land was given in sort of parcels that were next to each other. So you had all of the siblings that had land next to each other. That is suggestive of Indian land, because if you think about it, many people who were considered Negro or colored or black during that time, if they were enslaved, they certainly would not have been getting land allotments. And so that is an indication that that's what it was going on. And one thing to note was the question about slavery. And so the question was asked very directly, was my grandparent a descendant of anyone who was enslaved? Even though this is for Indian benefits, that question is there. Why? Because sometimes individuals had enslaved ancestors, and many Indians were enslaved. And here we see additional questions. Now these questions get more specific because what they are trying to figure out is the extent to which my grandparent has already received benefits according to the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek. And so again, they are trying to make sure that people are not double dipping and that people are making claims based upon one dynamic or another. And one of the interesting things to note was that there were questions in the testimony related to culture. And so, again, this is very unusual in terms of lineage, in terms of heritage. And so there was this dynamic of asking questions about speaking the actual Choctaw language or Choctaw language. And so, again, that is not something that anyone would be asked in terms of inheriting from their parents. But they were putting all of these tests in place for individuals who were Indian. And of course, this is interesting because in many instances, people were penalized for exercising their culture and then often penalized for not exercising their culture. Okay, one of the things that we're going to touch on as we are wrapping up is the issue of HR 40, and it's a major issue, and it relates to naming. And there have been other videos that I've done related to this issue of naming and holding on to names, but there have been so many alterations in the census records over the years. You've had people change from Indian to Negro to colored to black to now African American, and Negro is no longer on the census. And so what happens is that people get written out of history. And another concern is that there were no people really called African Americans when slavery started. And so to have a bill that is specific to African Americans and African American quote unquote slaves is perhaps a problem. Previously, there were indications for slave, Negro, Indian, black, colored, African, and mulatto. Some people were even identifying as black Scot, black Irish, black Dutch, and black Brit. However, African American is a new phrase, a new identifier. And so this may actually serve as a mislabeling of claimants. And it may not be a big issue right now, but it is something that perhaps needs to be worked out in the long run in terms of making sure that you are capturing all of the individuals who would be under that big umbrella of individuals who are descendants of American slavery. And slavery is the institution of slavery, not just descendants of people who were specifically enslaved, and also American descendants of those who were victims of Jim Crow. And for many people, you're not talking about descendants, you're actually talking about people who are still living right now, who were born during Jim Crow. Now, as we wrap up, one thing that you need to remember on this journey is that the most important task is for you to know your own people and for you to own that. The heritage may not be the heritage that you thought it was, but whatever the heritage is, it is yours. It's your ancestry. It doesn't matter how far back that ancestry goes. And so if you are a Jones 5 generations past, you are a Jones today, and your descendants will be Joneses. And so that's very important to remember. And it doesn't matter if your ancestors were out of Europe, out of Africa, out of Asia, out of America. Those are your ancestors. And so there's no amount of legislation that can suddenly make them not your biological ancestors. And ancestry is complex. It's not that cut and dry. Many people would like for it to be cut and dry, and they would like to have this quote unquote clean lineage. It pretty much doesn't work that way. It all depends on what your ancestors were doing and who they were partnering with. Hoping the inaugural program on ancestry and legacy was beneficial to you on your journey to find your ancestors. And just remember, this dynamic is going to be very important for you, whether you are identifying again as A.D.O.S. or whether you're identifying as American Indian. Whatever you are identifying as, your first job is to actually identify these ancestors. You don't need a whole host of ancestors. You just need to find that one ancestor that fits under that rubric.